Blog Talk Radio.
There'll be spectacle, there'll be fantasy, there'll be daring do and stuff like you would never see.
Hey, a movie! Yeah, we're gonna be a movie!
Starring everybody
and me. There'll be heroes bold, there'll be comedy, and a lot of fuss that ends for us real happily. Hey, a movie! We can watch it all develop. Starring everybody
and me. We'll take the world and set it on its ear.
Come on, join in. We're gonna start right here.
And we are going to start right here. Hello, welcome to the 411 Summer Blockbusters series with myself and the 411 Jack of all trades, Jeff Harris, will be with us in just a moment. Tonight, we're going to talk about the latest in the Star Trek reboots, Star Trek Into Darkness. And before we get started tonight for our discussion of the latest Star Trek, I just want to go ahead and say this. Star Trek, as Gene Roddenberry designed it, conceived it, was supposed to be a look into the future. It was supposed to be a look at what would the world be like if all of the races got along. You know, what kind of a future could we have if everybody got along and we were able to focus all of our positive energy into, looking at the potential for humanity, which is why you saw the different races on the bridge of the Enterprise. And the show was heavily laden with science fiction. Kirk was not a gun-slinging, sword-swinging warrior. I mean, he did a little bit of that throughout the series, but for a weekly TV series, he had to be more dependent on his wits because you couldn't do, the kind of big budget, especially back when it was out, which I think was like the 60s. You couldn't do the sort of big budget action kind of thing that you do now. So that was Star Trek, and even Star Trek: The Next Generation, I think, captured the spirit of what Gene Roddenberry was going after. It wasn't until about midway through Star Trek Deep Space Nine that the handlers at Paramount decided to take Star Trek in a completely different direction, made it more fan-friendly in terms of action, thematically started shifting it towards war, war with the Dominion, war with the Klingons, lots of action, lots of fighting. It was less about the more peaceful elements of Gene Roddenberry's universe and more of a Star Wars kind of a thing. So I know people tend to get upset with the new reboot that it's basically a space adventure, it's action adventure with people using Gene Roddenberry's characters. Here's what I will tell you. What you're going to hear for the next hour is a discussion of the movie on its own merits. We're not going to compare it to Gene Roddenberry's vision or the old Star Trek, and despite the fact that it features Khan, we're not even going to talk too much about the original Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan motion picture, because that's going to be another 5-hour podcast where I start yelling a lot, and that's not what this is about. We want to talk about the movie, and we have to talk about Wrath of Khan a little bit, but I think to be fair to the movie, you have to judge it on its own merits, not in comparison to the rest of the universe. So for those of you that are tuning into this podcast and you're like, well, it just doesn't match up with this and it doesn't match up with that, that's not what we're going to focus on in this podcast. Okay, I hope I've made myself clear there. This podcast is about this movie in and of itself and how it fits in with its predecessor, the Star Trek reboot, and that's it. That's about as far as I want to go. All right? So here to talk with me again is a panelist on the 401 Ground and Pound radio show, the 401 Jack of all trades. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Harris. How you doing, Jeff?
Space. The Fido. Frontier. Star date. 201305. 20. Captain Jeffrey Benjamin Harris. My first officer, Mark Radulich. Star Trek Into Darkness. of all the movies that I have encountered. It was this that was the most. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to The Long Road to Ruin. Our summer movie bonanza continues back into darkness. So let's get to it, everybody.
Now, can you do Rocket Man?
I'm sorry, I don't take requests. I'm not a performing monkey, Mark.
Oh, you're no fun, Jeff Harris. All right. Jeff, I'm going to ask you the same question at the beginning of every one of these podcasts to start us off, and that is, did you enjoy this movie?
Did I enjoy it? I saw the IMAX version on Saturday. Did I enjoy it? Yes, I did enjoy it.
You were entertained. I was entertained, too.
Not a terrible movie.
No. I didn't like it as much as Iron Man, just, to give people some awareness of what I liked more than the other. I thought Iron Man overall was a better movie. It was more. I enjoyed that more, but I was entertained for the whole 133 minutes that this thing ran, and I only started to. I got taken out of the movie in the last act with some of the things that happened, and but it wasn't until then that I started having some serious problems with the movie. Again, not that I wasn't entertained. Kirk's resolution, the resolution to what happens with Kirk, and the sort of flip-flop they do with things in this movie as compared to the Wrath of Khan really bugged me. So we're going to get there in just a minute, but I wanted to start off with the very first scene in the movie. I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Now, really quick, just give some background here. How did you come to Star Trek, and what is your relationship with the franchise?
I think I was really into science fiction as a kid. I think I would watch the original series when it would come on in reruns, and then I would watch the animated series when it was on Nickelodeon, back before Nickelodeon had a lot of original programming. And I think really what really got me into Star Trek was the movies more than anything. The movies with the original cast in the 80s and 90s was kind of mainly what I was looking at for Star Trek. And I love the movie.
Yeah, so do I. Star Trek II is probably one of my all-time favorite movies. It's definitely up there. I love The Wrath of Khan, so that's part of why I was kind of excited about this one once I learned that Khan was going to be in it. How he was going to be in it was remarkable. But I was excited about this movie because I love Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and really that whole mini trilogy in the Star Trek Prime series of movies. That was fun for me. I mean, most people don't like Star Trek 3, the Search for Spock, and they regard Star Trek 4 to almost not be a Star Trek movie. But I like them. Star Trek 6 is also up there for me, and Star Trek 5 I famously refer to as the Apology. But be that as it may, my father was a big Star Trek fan, and every year for Christmas, I would get him 2 Star Trek VHS tapes, and we would watch them. So I was fairly familiar with the series. And one thing that is consistent in all of the various iterations of Star Trek, whether it be the television shows or movies derived from the television shows, is that Starfleet has a prime directive. And that prime directive is we shall not interfere in the natural progression of a species on a planet. And that was sort of the whole setup to, the 5-year mission to go and explore space and all of that. And something that I asked my father, and my father's sort of the Radulich resident expert on Star Trek, I said, Dad, when you watched the show, was Kirk prone to constantly breaking the prime directive on the television show? Like, when it's supposed to be early on in his career as captain? And he said, no, I mean, sometimes he skirted around it, but he never outright broke it. Which leads me to the first scene of this movie, and I want to get your reaction to this. Kirk is barely the captain of the Enterprise in this movie, and he not only violates the Prime Directive, he smashes the Enterprise right through it. I mean, there was no getting around this. There was no skirting. There was no subtlety. There was direct intervention in the progress of a species. And I don't even care that they saw the spaceship. That whole the setup to that scene was a volcano was going to explode and wipe these people out, and they interfered in what happened with the volcano, which led to them revealing the spaceship. It bothered me. Did that bother you?
it didn't bother me. I think Kirk was faced with the dilemma. I think he had a bond with Spock. He wanted to save Spock.
Well, before Spock was ever in danger, the fact that that he decided to get involved with this volcano in the first place.
Oh. Well, I mean, I think that's just kind of, to me, this is just sort of part and parcel with Star Trek. We've seen, besides the original series and the original cast, we've seen the crew of the Enterprise or the crew just sort of come in conflict where they're faced with a primitive or developing society that they're either sick or on the verge of extinction, and they in the Enterprise, of course, the crew has the power to help, but they're faced with are we interfering with the natural order of things by saving these people? My viewpoint is, as an optimist and as a pragmatist, I think if you have the power to help people and to save lives, I think you should do it. Who is to say that's not part of the natural order, that you come upon a people and you can help them in some way? To me, that's, if you have the power to help someone, I think ultimately you should do it. And I think, to me, that's not really a violation, but I'm sure that's a debate. I think Kirk made a good move.
I thought it was interesting storytelling. When I first watched the movie and I saw that scene play out, I said, okay, well, this is going somewhere. If this is leading to a payoff later on in the movie, as it should, as the opening scene, or this establishes something about these characters that's important throughout the movie, thematically, characterization-wise, whatever, I'm okay with it. If there's no payoff, I'm going to be really frustrated that they went out of this way to do something, to me, that is so out of character in the Star Trek universe, either this version or the other.
Because I'm used to seeing Kirk break the rules. He made a whole career in all the material we've seen really out of breaking the rules. So I didn't really have a problem with it. Of all the problems I have with the movie, that was not one.
Okay. It was, like I said, I didn't viscerally react to it when I first saw it. It was when the whole movie was over, it became I went back and reflected of what frustrated me about this movie. That was one of the ththings that jumped out at me. Once I saw how everything played out, I was like, I went back to it and I went, yeah, that still doesn't sit right with me. I don't feel like it bugs me. Now,
you're a hater, Mark.
Am I a hater? Is that what you said?
Haters gonna hate.
Shut up, you. Now listen. So moving on. What was one of the first things that you had a problem with? Okay, I said I've had some difficulty with that opening scene and all the things that it sets up. Once I got to the end of the movie, what was one of the things that jumped out at you that you had a problem with?
Your question is, what are the things I had a problem with?
What was one of the things that you said that you had a slew of problems with this movie? What was the first thing?
Benedict Cumberbatch. If we're going to go ahead and say who he's playing, yes. Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan Noonien Singh. Okay,
so tell me about that, because I thought his performance was. I mean, look, if he had started doing his impression of Ricardo Montalban, who played Khan in Star Trek II, that would have been terrible. I thought he did his own sort of interpretation of the character. He played the character that was written for him. I thought he did a fine enough job with it. I thought he ate the scenery up. What was your issue?
My issue was I felt it was even though I felt it was inevitable that we would see the filmmakers do their own version of Khan or Wrath of Khan, just because it's such a classic character and a classic movie. I kind of dreaded it just because I'm always kind of leery of, rehashes and going back to the well. And let me just be clear. I love Benedict Cumberbatch. I love his work as an actor. I love Sherlock. I think his work on Sherlock is fantastic. I love that show. I just think his Khan was just way too different. In a way, the other cast members are not different from the characters they're playing based on previous interpretations. And I believe he was miscast as Khan, and I think he should have just been playing a brand new original character rather than having to attach him to the character of Khan. Just because, like, when he's saying he's Khan, I'm like, I don't believe this is Khan. I don't see him as Khan, and I feel like he was a totally different character. I don't think he was the character from Space Seed, and I mean, I know he's doing his own interpretation and spin on it, but I just couldn't connect him to that character. Maybe I'm bringing in my past baggage. I just think the way Benedict Cumberbatch is and the way he performs, I just think it was wrong to sort of attach him to a character like Khan, because I just didn't get Khan from him.
Okay, here's where I agree with you. I don't totally agree with what you're saying, but the part that I do is I felt like this was a very self-aware movie. Like, the way that it was shot and the way that the action plays out, it seemed like the intent was that this was a very fan service friendly movie. So the scene in which he reveals that he's Khan, you have no knowledge of this character beforehand. You just know that he's John Harrison and he killed a bunch of high-ranking Starfleet officers and he blew up an archive. That's it. You know nothing of the super soldiers. You know nothing of that era of that universe. And you certainly know nothing of him in particular. So when there's the reveal, it's a very dramatic, like pulling off the mask, and he goes, "I am Khan." Except that you have no idea who fucking Khan is. So it was one of those.
Yeah. That whole scene was a poor payoff to me, just because we're all supposed to like go crazy because like we know who,
right?
So the fans know who Khan is. And that didn't work for me. I think
within that scene,
that whole reveal was convoluted. The whole reveal was convoluted and contrived, and it didn't work for me at all.
Right. It was one of those deals where Pike, as Kirk, should have just laughed. It was like, "I am Khan, so you are." I can imagine Eddie Izzard in that scene. Yes, sir. Yes, you are. And that means what to me exactly?
I don't know. I just think this is kind of the flaws of Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman as writers. They kind of like to do fan servicey references a lot without really giving it that extra substance and development that it really needs to really resonate. I think I really love the first Star Trek, the 2009 movie. And I feel that movie was much tighter and effective in a way this one was not, which I feel they tried too hard to try to appeal to fans of Wrath of Khan and fans of Khan, and I don't think it really worked as well.
Yeah, and I guess we should talk about it now, just because I want to make sure we have time for it. Let's talk about this third act. Now, I'll get the audience there. So Khan as John Harrison attacks Starfleet and then beams across the galaxy to the Klingon homeworld of Cronus. Kirk gets permission from Admiral Marcus to go after him. They do. They're armed with 72 super torpedoes that they threaten him with, and he gives up, surrenders, and he goes back to the ship. And there's this big back and forth where eventually he reveals that he's Khan. And then there's another reveal that Alexander Marcus is really the bad guy. And what the plot of the movie is that after all the events of the first movie and some things that have happened in between movies, Admiral Marcus believes that war with the Klingons is upon us, and that they need to get ready, and they needed Khan in order to do that. And it was sort of my enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a deal. So Kirk is caught between Khan and Alexander Marcus, and Marcus eventually gets fed up with Kirk and decides he's going to blow him up. Okay? Which takes us to the last act of this movie, where it starts to resemble a cover song of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So let me stop there for a second and just kind of tell people, if you've never seen Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, there's a bit where Kirk and part of his crew are abandoned on a prefabricated planet, which is one of the heavy plot points of the movie, called Genesis. And Khan reveals that he has abandoned them there with no way to get off this planet, and Kirk yells and screams into the camera in his very iconic way, "Khan!" which makes sense because Kirk is a really passionate guy. It wouldn't make sense for Spock to do that. Spock is a robotic Vulcan. Keep that in mind. A little bit later on in the movie, in a fight between Khan in a ship that in a Starfleet ship that he has captured and the Enterprise, they get into a dogfight in the middle of space where the Enterprise is practically crippled. They end up defeating Khan anyway, but in doing so, they almost destroy the warp core. So Spock, having established in the first scene of the movie that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one or the few, which is also a reoccurring theme in this movie, goes into the warp core. Now this should sound familiar. Fixes the warp core, but in doing so irradiates his body. But before he does that, he puts his consciousness into McCoy, which will play out in the next movie. His body dies. They throw him into space, and there's a line between Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner. You are and always will be my friend. Now, why is that important, that line? They have been friends for decades now. They have developed this really, really close relationship after having been on a 5-year mission and having had spent all of this time together and developing a very strong relationship. So Kirk is naturally beside himself when Spock gives his life to save the crew of the Enterprise, who were going to die. That's what drove me nuts about the last part of this movie, because if you saw it, you know that they did almost all of that in this one, only they kept reversing roles. So you had Spock, the Vulcan, screaming Khan into the camera, which seemed like Darth Vader yelling no at the end of Revenge of the Sith. You had Kirk, who doesn't have the ability to put his conscience into somebody else in case they ever, revive his body, going into the warp core to save everybody. It just, I don't know. What was your reactions? I know I was frustrated by it. I know that seeing all of this stuff that happened so much later in these guys' life, and in another movie altogether, where everything is reversed, I was like, this to me doesn't A, add up to any of the rest of the story. B, this is just fan service. This is just winking at the audience. And if you have no prior knowledge of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, you have to be sitting there wondering why any of this is happening.
It was weird. I think they tried a little too hard to mimic the Wrath of Khan dynamic by having all those sort of callbacks to Wrath of Khan. I think instead of making it more like a space seed encounter. And I think the problem was, I think making Benedict Cumberbatch into Khan and trying to make it into their version of Wrath of Khan. So I definitely understand the complaints about the end of the movie. I do like this idea that Spock coming. I think I like the scene because I like the idea of Spock coming to the realization that, hey, Kirk is actually my friend. He's actually my first, true friend. And I'm emotional about, I'm having emotions about that. I think that works. I like that idea. And I like the idea that Kirk is saying, the reason I saved you is because we are friends, and I didn't want you to die. It's not just about, being my swag, showing my swagger and laughing at the roles in the Prime Directive. I wanted to save you because you're my friend and I care about what happens to you. I like that idea. I think it was just played, they kind of stumbled about the way they played it. I think the scream was a little too much just because I had a problem with the scream because at that point, okay, we just blew Khan up. We think Khan's gone. Like, the scream in the second Star Trek movie, he was talking to Khan on the communicator, and Khan was, just messed him up, and Kirk is ticked off and screaming at him after Khan had this really awesome monologue about how he's going to hurt Kirk. So for the way for Spock to scream, because we just defeated Khan, I mean, it seemed weird to have him scream in that moment. I think they choreographed and they set the scream up wrong. I think if they had an idea that, okay, Khan got away, he did this, he caused Kirk to die, he's heading toward Earth, we have to go after him. But then at that point, that wasn't the case. So I think it was sort of a poorly timed, poorly put together B. I think if they set it up better, it would have worked for me. But the way they set it up, it was clumsily done. And then everything after was extremely clumsy, but that's a whole other thing I would like to get into next, what happened after and how clumsily it was handled.
Well, let me say this. This is supposed to be a reflection of Kirk and Spock prior to the 5-year mission. And yes, they developed a relationship in the first movie, but there was a lot of animus throughout most of that movie, which gets resolved towards the end. And I don't think they've even been together all that long by the time this one goes. This is, again, before the 5-year mission. So when did they have time to develop such a strong relationship? It's just hang on. Let me make my final point on this, and then I'll let you rebut.
Okay.
My problem here is that the writers seem to very much want to bring in all of these elements that were established in the movies, but but people seem to keep forgetting that when the movies came out, they had been together for decades. They were also much older.
Okay, I understand that, but I think what people are misinterpreting is that this was more about Kirk and Spock discovering their friendship and realizing they are friends, more so than the friendship coming to an end. This long, these guys who have been through everything together and been through hell together, hell and back together, and they're still friends even as they get older. That's not what was going on here. This was more about, hey, I realize, we are friends, and I realize the powerful bond of friendship or whatever. I think that's what some people are misinterpreting about the movie. But again, I think that it was not handled as effectively as it could. Now, some time has passed between this movie and the last movie. I know it's not really inherent in this movie, but there's a lot of things that have been happening. There's a video game story that has a lot of Kirk and Spock activity. They're doing sort of casual things like they like to play 3D chess, which is sort of funny. And they have been in space together for some time. They have worked together for some time. This is not just 2 weeks after the last movie, Mark. You know what I mean? Sometimes
I understand that. But
missions together, and he's his first officer.
But let me say this to you, Jeff. There is a philosophy among people who watch movies that they don't care about the extra material. They don't care about books, video games, web series, etc. If it's not in the movie, it doesn't count. And
I totally get that. But at the same time, some time has passed between the two movies, and they have been in space together for some time, and they have been doing missions for some time as well. It's probably been 2 years or so.
I want to talk about Kirk's resolution because for someone who said at the beginning of this, I enjoyed this movie. Boy, have we been doing a lot of complaining about it. So I do want to get to some of the more positive things about this movie. But I have one final quibble, which rhymes with tribble, which brings me to my next point. So there's a really telegraphed part of this movie that leads to the resolution of Kirk's storyline, and that was as they're talking to Khan in the medical bay, they get a blood sample from him, and McCoy is experimenting with the tribble and the blood sample, and they're in the middle. And they're in the middle of this conversation, and Kirk, for no reason that I could tell, pulls his head out of the conversation long enough to ask McCoy what he's doing with the blood sample, and McCoy explains.
No. He specifically asked McCoy. He like Khan is like, what are you going to give me? You can't even guarantee the safety of your crew. And Kirk's giving him the 1,000-yard stare, and he doesn't even break the stare. And he's like, McCoy, what are you doing with that tribble?
Yeah,
he wants to know what's going on with the tribble.
You can look, if you enjoyed that sort of thing, that was fine. It seemed odd to me that you're in this.
Agree with how odd it is.
Okay.
I agree with how odd it is and how it's.
Yeah, I mean, he's sitting there essentially trying to intimidate the guy, and in the middle of it is like, what you doing with the tribble? Like, wait, what?
I like that he doesn't break the stare, and he's like, what are you doing with that tribble? He's Clint.
Yeah.
Clint Eastwood, what are you doing with that tribble, Bones?
Right. So, and McCoy says, well, Khan's blood regenerates like nothing I've ever seen before, alluding to the fact that he's, superhuman. And he goes like, so I want to see what happens to this tribble, this dead tribble, when I inject Khan's blood, see what it'll do, something along those lines. And right there, I'm like, oh Christ, they're gonna kill Kirk. I didn't think they'd do it the exact same way they killed Spock, but again, we've already established that.
They telegraphed.
Yeah, it's way telegraphed. You see that coming a mile away, to the point where, it's supposed to be an emotional scene, and if you've never seen The Wrath of Khan, at least you have the novelty of Kirk sacrificing himself for the crew. So, like, the people that I saw it with who'd never seen the movie before don't know why I walk out of the movie going, I don't want to talk about this. This was a cover song of The Wrath of Khan. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, go watch the movie, then you'll know. They didn't have that fresh memory in their head. However, we all agreed that we saw them using Khan's blood to revive Kirk after he's dead a mile away. But here's the part that really throws me for a loop, and this is what I want your response to.
Uh-huh.
There are 72 super soldiers on the Enterprise in torpedoes.
Right.
They all have the exact same thing going on, which means theoretically any one of them should have been able to supply Kirk with a blood transfusion. Tell me why in the wild chase scene between Spock and Khan, they're sitting there going, Spock, don't kill him. We need him. No, you don't. You don't need him. You have 72 people who can do the exact same function. You're a witness.
Here's my thought process was, I guess they're going on the logic that we only know Khan's blood is the blood that works. I guess that was the internal logic of the story. I think I was going the same way with you. Okay, we're gonna get someone out of the cryotube. We're just gonna use that person's blood. But maybe they were worried that waking that person up and synthesizing their blood would cause havoc with that. But yeah, I think for the sake of the story, they could have just said, okay, we'll just use this person's blood, and we'll just use that. We don't need Khan.
No, I'll tell you what it was they wrote themselves into a dead end. They left it open. They left the ending of the movie open so that they could do the Wrath of Khan later on, or Space Seed. I guess Space Seed would be the next event.
Again, like I said, it's clumsy. The third act was very clumsily put together. It was problematic, and I think all the mystery that they tried to force on the movie, I think is why it's not doing so. Why it's kind of underperformed this weekend. I think J.J. Abrams, Star Trek is not lost. J.J. Abrams, don't try to make Star Trek into Lost. They didn't do that with the first movie, and I think trying to make this movie into Lost and give it all this mystery and plot twist, I think it doesn't work for Star Trek. That's not what Star Trek is. I'm sorry.
No, and to your point, Jeff, and to your point about, I didn't mind them, they're using Zod in Man of Steel, and I haven't seen the movie yet, but I don't mind when movies go and bring back classic characters, but use them appropriately. I think the problem with this movie was, A, Khan was misused, B, they're relying too much on classic characters, and they're shoehorning them into the movie as opposed to writing out a good story that uses them appropriately. So I think the next movie, if they really want to make sure that this franchise is vibrant and continues to draw in new fans and has a nice long lifespan, I think they need to go. The next movie needs to rely entirely on new villains, new characters, and a new story. Nothing that they can draw from. Don't pull anything from the old series in. You know,
I agree,
you're talking about the 5-year mission here. There's plenty of stuff to do in that 5 years without having to even touch the series.
Okay, now here's where the movie kind of busts wide open for me. The end of the movie, Khan, he survives the initial explosion of the torpedoes on the Vengeance. He takes the Vengeance, a ship that is twice the size of the Enterprise. He crashes it in to freaking San Francisco. Buildings are leveled. It's in the middle of the day. Tons of people are outside. We can only assume that thousands of people are dead in the explosions. Tens of thousands likely. Okay, so not only that, the head of Starfleet, the freaking head of Starfleet, organized this whole cabal and sort of secret organization to build, weapons, and to basically start an all-out war with Klingon, blah, 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 to kind of, take the fight to the Klingons. Basically, Admiral Marcus was George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, whatever. Khan was Osama bin Laden. Khan was made into Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein.
Are there people really making that argument?
I mean, it's hard to ignore. They basically made Vulcan's destruction into 9/11. So Vulcan's destruction was this universe's version of 9/11, and they made it a microcosm for Iraq, Afghanistan, and it's hard to ignore, especially with the post 9/11 veteran dedication right before the closing credits. So you had all that, and then but here's my big problem: you have a ship, you have San Francisco's freaking leveled, and no one cares. We're talking about a freaking genocide here. A city's destroyed. Thousands of people are dead. Starfleet is responsible. They're going on their. To me, there's no 5-year mission after that. Starfleet should be screwed 6 ways to Sunday after all this. The head of Starfleet organized a conspiracy that freaking went against all of the rules and directives of Starfleet. To me, Starfleet's in freaking trouble and is at the verge of extinction at the end of this movie. So to go that far and to not really have any consequences, that's kind of what I have a problem with. The Enterprise is not going on a 5-year mission as they did after something like that. And the Enterprises, they're going before, whoever the president of the Federation is, and they're getting slaps on the wrist, and they're fighting court-martials, something.
Yeah.
There was no reckoning. There was no reckoning after what took place, and I have a big problem with that.
Let me sum this up very quickly because we are running short on time now, and I want to say something positive about this movie. But my father and I were talking about it earlier. If you assume that the events of the first movie shifted this universe so far away from what the universe was supposed to be in Shatner's Star Trek, then you can do wild and crazy things and speed certain things up. I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, and I had a problem with all of a sudden, Starfleet, which was just supposed to be a federation of planets for the peaceful coexistence of the universe, has now suddenly turned into this paramilitary operation, which it doesn't do for thousands of years into the future in Deep Space Nine, mind you. that was quite a leap for me.
It's
but
not
again,
it's not actually thousands of years later in DS9. It's more like a couple. It's more like a couple hundred years.
Couple hundred years, fine. In any case, for them to have brought that plot line in, I said, well, I guess after blowing up Vulcan, I can assume that whole universe, like in Back to the Future, it just skews way far away from what we knew it as, and you're starting off a fresh thing. Okay, fine. Still, as you're saying, if that's the case, if they're so worried about a war with the Klingons and they're now developing warships and all of that, why would you then send one of your biggest and best ships out on a 5-year exploration mission when you're too busy worried that hostile natives are going to invade? You're right. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, the intent was at the ending was that, okay, we went too far here. So now we're going back to being what Starfleet really is, and we've removed the bad element. But it's just my feeling is after they went that far, and after a warship crashes into San Francisco and a city is destroyed and buildings are leveled and people are dead, people are going to be angry, and shouldn't there be a reckoning for Starfleet after that? The head of Starfleet was behind this. Couldn't this cause Starfleet to be
considering the way that they've treated Kirk's career, they just should have made him the president of Starfleet. Considering no matter what he does, he gets a promotion in these movies.
It was hard for me to rectify what was going on at the end, in that there were no consequences to. It felt like no one really took responsibility for what happened. There were no consequences. There was no reckoning, and just back to normal. I'm just not okay with that at the end.
Right, which emotionally makes this Transformers instead of Iron Man. There's no emotional heft to it. It's just, lots of big fun space action scenes and, good fisticuffs, and there's nothing more to it than that.
Now, let me be clear. Now, I think a kind of a microcosm kind of worked a lot better in the Undiscovered Country. In Undiscovered Country, it was they were pretty blatant that it was basically a microcosm for the end of the Cold War. And they came up with this idea that, okay, there's an element within Starfleet that doesn't want to, they don't want to make peace with the Klingons, so we're gonna collude with some conspirators, and we're gonna screw everything up. And then Kirk himself has to face his own demons and his own conflicts with the Klingons, and just kind of put that aside. And
right. It worked in the Undiscovered Country, but there had been decades of conflicts with Klingons by that point. There was more to it than what we see in this movie. All right, the one thing that really hang on.
That was as a microcosm. That was done as a microcosm for the end of the Cold War, and for years the Russians were our enemies and were the bad guys, and we saw them as, and suddenly they're our friends. And some people were like, hey, this is kind of weird that suddenly the Russians are our friends now. Are they really our friends? And I think that was a very interesting way. I think they tried to do something here that was basically a take
it was very ham-handed.
Post 9/11 America, the world post 9/11, and it didn't really work very well.
No, and it's a good pickup that you noticed it, but that was the thing. I was so far removed from my mind because that's not really what I want to see in a Star Trek movie. On the one hand, yes, there needs to be some drama and emotional heft to it and stakes and all of those other things, but what I don't really need to see is a parable for modern geopolitics. All right, real quick, I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that really worked for me in this movie. So it opens up, as I said, with Kirk deciding to violate the Prime Directive, and there's a scene that's supposed to then tie into the very end of the movie where Spock is in the volcano trying to stop it from erupting and killing all these people, and they can't get Spock out of the volcano initially, not without making the ship visible to the natives. So Spock at that point realizes, well, if everything follows logically, I'm about to die. At which point he sort of goes into the Zen space, and just as he's about to die, they beam him out of there. Okay, fine. That later on, a little bit later into the movie, you find out that him and Uhura, who are still in a relationship, are now not on speaking terms. This leads later on to a conflict between the two of them, where she's confronting him about his essentially lack of concern for how his death would affect her. For all of the life and death and sacrifice and everything else that fell flat for me, this was the one emotional scene in the movie that actually rung out to me. Uhura's bit with Spock here, where she's saying, essentially, you choose not to feel anything as if my feelings in this don't matter. And then Spock explains himself saying, until I mind melded with Pike, I didn't know what death was, and I didn't want to. And I had the feeling of Vulcan blowing up. That was quite enough for me. And I don't want to feel. And I didn't. When I thought I was going to die, I didn't want to feel anything. But that's not a reflection of how I feel for you. And that was the most. It was, to me, it was subtle, and it was one of the most powerful exchanges of dialogue and show of emotion in the movie. I really liked it. I liked the way Uhura and Spock played off each other in that scene and what little they got to do with each other in the movie.
There was a lot I did like in the movie. I do like Zachary Quinto's performance as Spock, and I like seeing a kind of conflicted, emotional Spock. You know, more of a half human Spock who's kind of torn between both worlds. And I like the relationship with Uhura. I really liked in the first movie he has a romantic relationship with her, and it's intact by the end of the movie, and they're still in a relationship here. All that's very interesting to me. Unfortunately, it kind of gets resolved very quickly, just as quickly as it's presented. But I don't want to harp on that too much. I saw the movie on IMAX. It did look very good on IMAX. Unfortunately, it wasn't 3D. I hated the 3D. I hate converted 3D. We don't need it. The movie did not need to be converted into 3D. There were only a couple parts where the 3D, I think, kind of popped out, but it was overall very pointless. I think just shooting it in IMAX, I think, was enough, and I don't think it needed a forced converted 3D gimmick. Set design, costumes were fantastic. I like getting to see Kronos. What little we did see of the Klingons, I liked. So I like maybe there's going to be a greater conflict in the next movie with the Klingons, so that thread is there. And generally, I like this cast a great deal.
I think my favorite performance throughout the entire movie was actually Simon Pegg's. I really, really enjoyed his performance as Scotty.
Simon Pegg, I think, is the best part of the cast. He does do a great Scotty.
Well, I enjoyed. I liked how they wrote him off the show, wrote him off the ship, and then how he ends up coming back on and all the stuff that he gets to do in the third act of the movie. I really, really enjoyed. I thought Simon Pegg was the bit with Uhura and Spock and Simon Pegg were probably the two saving graces for this movie in terms of individual performances. Because Chris Pike,
the only character I didn't like and I think should have been cut was Alice Eve as Carol Marcus.
See, I disagree with you, and I read that in Jeremy Thomas's review and some of the comments. As we all know, Carol Marcus and Kirk get together and have a kid in the original universe. I'm assuming that's the direction why they included her here. I
Carol
thought she
Marcus
gave a
since the Genesis device, which essentially is responsible for resurrecting Spock.
Yes, I like her character in this. I thought people have accused her of being a do-nothing character. I thought the whole bit with her and McCoy when they were trying to detonate or trying to open up the torpedo, I thought that was fine. I thought that gave them something to do. It's hard when you have an ensemble cast to give everybody enough to do to justify their being in the movie other than fan service.
That wasn't so much my problem with her. My problem with her was I feel it was another kind of a fan servicey thing where hey, Carol Marcus, we know what happens with Carol Marcus and Kirk, and it just didn't work for me. I just don't feel I don't feel she served much of a purpose to the plot to really, for her presence to really matter.
I thought she tied in
really
well
have...
with I thought she tied in well with the Admiral's motivations. You know, he wanted to build up an armada to take on the Klingons.
I think you could have had all those scenes with the Admiral Marcus character without her being there.
No, my point is that the early stuff with her and Spock, you know, why are you on this ship? And, you know, and it's redundant to have two science officers. I don't know. I thought it was fun. I thought there was a little bit of mystery there. Kept me engaged in the plot. I know. I disagree with you. I thought her involvement in the movie was adequate. And I enjoyed her performance. She
was the Maya Hansen of this movie.
Maya Hansen. All right, Jeff, last licks here. I've pretty much exhausted my pistol on this movie. I don't really have much else to say. What anything else that you feel got left unsaid in this podcast discussion regarding the movie? Good, bad, or indifferent?
I'm not sure. I think we do need to address, since we might as well, the movie did kind of go below expectations at the box office this weekend. It made only $70 million for the weekend. It was released earlier in the week, and it made, I think, around $83 million for its first 4 or 5 days of release. So that's a little troublesome because the first movie in 2009 opened much higher, and that's 4 years ago. So think about this. 3D ticket prices are higher. IMAX ticket prices are higher. The first movie didn't have that, plus ticket price inflation, and it's not quite as impressive. So I would assume Paramount's got to be a little worried right now and about what's going on, because this movie had a much bigger budget, so it's a little concerning. The state of the franchise is a little concerning, considering the way they built this up and built it up as this big event, you know, like to be this big event, summer event performer, and I think the way they marketed the movie backfired.
Now, the way they marketed the movie in terms of trying to keep the identity of Khan hidden, in other words, you know.
That was a mistake. I think that was a mistake because the way it's revealed, it wasn't much of a mystery in the movie. They tried to market this kind of like Lost and like a J.J. Abrams TV show, and I understand not wanting to spoil things for the audience, but I think making it a big mystery, I think was stupid, and I think it was a bad move that backfired. I think they lost a little momentum releasing it 4 years after the last movie, because the first movie was considerably popular and they had some momentum, and I think they lost a little bit waiting 4 years in between. It's quite a bit of time for a sequel like this, and I don't know. I'm a little concerned just because I would like to see the franchise continue with this cast, and it is underperforming right now.
I wonder how much of this has to do with the fact that, I mean, I know for me, and I try not to read a lot of the spoilers and a lot of the insider Hollywood stuff. You know, I just want to go and be entertained by a fun movie. And I remember watching the trailer and getting this impression that it was going to be, and this is where my Star Trek lore gets a little fuzzy, but I thought this was going to be Khan and his minions declaring war on the Federation. And you know, my only reservation about that was, well, that's not really Star Trek. That's a war on the planet. That's not ships flying around in space. And then you don't get him and his minions. You get just Khan, and what you end up getting is, you know, a really, really short chase, and then a lot of yelling back and forth over whether or not the Federation should be warlike or not.
I think the next movie needs to be more. I think they can do fun. They can do all the fun ride stuff, but still make it more like Star Trek, too.
Yeah. Like I said, I think the next one. I think if they're gonna pull on the thread that they established in this movie, then there's a great line in this about how the Klingons have already taken over 2 planets in the Federation. Just keep going with that. You know, let the Klingons start encroaching on Federation space. Let them continue with the Dreadnought class spaceships, and while this and let the Enterprise be doing something behind the scenes while this is all going on. Take them back to the home world. Give the Enterprise, give the folks on the Enterprise something to do while the greater universe is tearing itself apart. And I think that would be fun. As odd as it might be to say that out loud, I think that might be a fun idea.
It's weird though, because the way the movie ends, it ends with them going away on the 5-year mission. So now they're in space on the 5-year mission. Are they going to get called back because of this? Are the Klingons going to start building their military might? I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see where it goes. But at the same time, I think they kind of wrote themselves into a corner by sending them off on the 5-year mission at the end.
Yep, we'll see what happens. Maybe the next movie takes place at the end of the 5-year mission. Who the hell knows? All right, Jeff. We have come to the glorious conclusion. Now, the next time we do this, it'll be in a couple of weeks when I get back from the Outer Banks. I'll have just seen Man of Steel, and that'll be our next summer blockbuster podcast. I'm debating whether or not I want to go see the Lone Ranger. And honestly, the only reason I'd be leaning in favor of going to see that would be just so I could talk about it with you. But other than that, other than Man of Steel and possibly the Lone Ranger, I think the only other movie coming out this summer that I had a tremendous amount of interest in obviously was Wolverine. What do you got going on? I know we just did the MMA show yesterday, but why don't you go ahead and plug your stuff again?
All right, so new Blu-ray review coming out for Superman Unbound, just in time for the Man of Steel. The next Fast and the Furious movie, we'll have an early review up of that later this week. Also later this week, the MMA's 3 Hours edition of UFC on FX8. Also, all right. Mark, want to thank you again for letting me join into this. I had a lot of fun. Peace, live long and prosper, my friend.
All right, folks. Tomorrow night on The Long Road to Ruin, Sean Comer, Robert Winfrey, and I will tackle the first 2 Scream movies. And then a week from tomorrow, Robert Cooper and I are back for our first look at thrash metal mega band Megadeth. We'll be back on the 401 Ground and Pound show Sunday night at 9 o'clock to review UFC 160, Cain Velasquez versus Antonio Bigfoot Silva. If you want to check out my thoughts prior to Extreme Rules, WWE's Extreme Rules, check out thecasualheroes.com and their latest WrestleCast. And Thursday night at 9 o'clock, of course, is The Right Hook on FromTheRightRadio.com. All right, with that, we wish you be well, be safe, and behave.